John Paul II, the Pope who traveled the world, shot and seriously wounded inside Vatican City itself. Tonight, a special expanded edition of Nightline. We'll have the latest on the Pope's condition. We'll examine the background of the man accused of shooting him, and we'll have reports on reaction in this country and throughout the world.
This is an expanded edition of ABC News Nightline. Reporting from Washington, Ted Koppel.
Good evening. Someone tried to kill the Pope today and came dangerously close. Italian police think they know who the would-be assassin is. At least they have a suspect under arrest. More on him and his motives later. The Pope lies in a Rome hospital tonight following almost 4.5 hours of surgery earlier today. It appears that he will recover, but it was very, very close. And the world came within a heartbeat of losing a man who has already made an extraordinary impression around the world. Later in this broadcast, we'll be discussing John Paul's spiritual and political impact. But first, a look back at this morning. 11:17 Eastern Time. In Rome, it was 5:17 in the afternoon. Among the crowd of 15,000 or so pilgrims and tourists, Lowell Newton. Mr. Newton is editorial director of ABC's Detroit television station, WXYZ, and he later gave his eyewitness account of what happened in Vatican Square this morning.
He had come from one side of the Vatican riding in that special vehicle where he can stand in the back holding onto a handrail. He had made one complete circle of the crowd at St. Peter's Square. A tight circle, but he went totally through the crowd, reaching over, shaking hands as he went. And as he got back to the head of the crowd, we all thought he was then going up on the papal throne. But apparently he told his driver, let's go around one more time, and this time swing out a little wider, because he did come out further into the crowd, almost to the fringes. And as he passed perhaps 3/4 of the way through that swing, and as he was doing, gesturing, waving, and leaning way over, we all heard 3 quick shots in succession. There was just an instance of silence, and then the screams from that area. We were about 50 yards from the area at the time, and the crowd swarmed over it. I did see the Pope clearly release his grip from the handrail and slump into the bottom of the vehicle. At which point the crowds just swarmed over the vehicle, and almost immediately armed the guards. There hadn't been any scene previous to that. Came out around the vehicle and stayed for about 10 seconds, and then the vehicle drove off. A lot of screaming and yelling going on, with the police apparently capturing a gunman or someone very near the scene. But the gunshots came in rapid succession, and apparently all from the very same location.
The woman you see being taken away there by a stretcher is Ann Odry. She is a 58-year-old widow from Buffalo, New York, who was one of 2 women wounded in the attack on Pope John Paul today. She is reported to be in serious condition tonight with a wound in the chest. There was another woman wounded. She was identified as a 22-year-old Jamaican, Rose Hall, and she is reported in good condition tonight. It is now early morning in Rome, and to bring us a late update on the situation there and on the Pope's condition, correspondent John Lawrence is standing by live now via telephone circuit from our Rome bureau. John, I understand you've taken a late tour around, and it is now just after 5:30 in the morning in Rome. What's the situation at the hospital? What's the situation at Vatican City?
Well, Ted, as the first pre-dawn glimmers of light come up over Rome, the Pope is resting in the intensive care unit of the hospital, having pulled through the long 5.5-hour operation to repair all the damage from those 3 bullet wounds. There's a small vigil on the ground floor of Gemelli Hospital, the most modern in Rome. There are a handful of reporters and a contingent of security police. I went by St. Peter's Square. It's cold and nearly deserted this morning. The great doors of the basilica closed now. Several truckloads of the Carabinieri, the Italian military police force, are drawn up on the fringes of the square, watching all who pass by. I saw a solitary, unarmed Swiss guard standing in between Bernini's colonnade. It's an eerie sight, Ted, for such a normally peaceful place.
John, I realize it's just prior to dawn there now, but what is the last word that you got from the hospital?
Just a few hours ago, his doctors announced that Pope John Paul II came through the operation, quote, satisfactorily tonight. His doctors say the Pope's prognosis remains guarded because of the risk of infection in his abdominal cavity. The pontiff suffered massive hemorrhaging, they said, from the bullet wounds in the abdominal cavity and his intestines. He required 6 pints of blood transfusions during that 5.5-hour operation. He was also wounded in the right arm and on the finger of his hand. Doctors who were treating the Pope say the august patient came through the operation in a satisfactory manner. The Pope, they said, was conscious and breathing without assistance. He said to be in good and stable condition. And a late report by the Italian State Broadcasting Network, RAI, says the Pope regained consciousness briefly a few hours ago, and he clearly recognized a visitor at his bedside. It was said to be the Italian president, Sandro Pertini, and people here are taking a great heart in the fact that the Pope knew who he was, Ted.
All right, John, one last peripheral question now. We're going to be getting into the subject of the would-be assailant who is now being held. The only question I would ask you, since the attack took place on the grounds of Vatican City, which of course is a separate country unto itself, who has control over the would-be assassin?
Yes, there's an old treaty between the Vatican and the government of Italy by which people who commit crimes or are accused of committing crimes on Vatican territory, the postage stamp size plot of land inside Rome, are prosecuted by the Italian government. So this would-be assassin will face charges by the Italian court.
All right, John Lawrence, thank you very much indeed. Now, back to the subject of the Pope and his condition. Dr. Peter Bruno, a specialist in internal medicine on the staff of Lenox Hill Hospital in New York, has been with us throughout most of this day, providing his expertise in assessing the Pope's medical condition. Dr. Bruno is standing by live now in our New York studios. Dr. Bruno, from what you have heard, give us a sense of what the problems may be or just where the Pope's condition now stands.
Okay. Well, apparently from what's been described, with the limited information we have, the Pope was struck probably with 2 different bullets in the region, this is the back, as we're demonstrating on our dummy here, in the region of the sacrum, which is the lower end of the spine. Fortunately, the bullets appeared to pass on one side or the other of the spinal column. Had there been any problem with the bullet hitting the spinal column, there would have been immediate paralysis, and apparently this is not the case, and we're very fortunate for that. Looking over to our other mannequin here, the bullet wound apparently traversed cephalad anteriorly toward the head through the intestines, which are demonstrated here, both the small and the large intestines. Once a bullet comes into the abdominal cavity, it actually ricochets quite a bit, and apparently there were several lacerations of the intestine, both the small and the large intestine. The bullet finally came up in the region of the pancreas, which is found back here, in through the stomach. The operation itself was to maintain hemostasis, that is, stop the bleeding in the abdominal cavity, and indeed the Pope was reported to have lost 3 liters of blood. The normal amount of blood in a body is 5 liters, so you can see this is a substantial amount. The two separate resections were done in the colon, where the actual hole in the intestinal wall was resected or cut out, and the 2 ends of the intestine were sewn back together again.
Dr. Bruno, let me just ask you this, and again, asking strictly from a layman's point of view, it looks as though there are an awful lot of very vital organs in that region. It seems as though the Pope was a very lucky man, all things considered.
Okay, absolutely. And if we really remove this area here and just look in the back, we see that the puncture wound coming in the back from the spine missed this whole area of the great vessels, the aorta and the inferior vena cava, which are the major vessels. A bullet glancing just slightly on either side would have affected these major vessels and really would have been a life-threatening catastrophe.
All right, Dr. Peter Bruno, thank you very much indeed. In a moment, we'll have a report on the Turkish terrorist accused of today's attempt on the life of Pope John Paul, and we'll talk live with a Turkish journalist about the accused assailant and his political background. The man accused of today's attack on Pope John Paul II is anything but an unknown in his native country, Turkey. There, he is a fugitive from justice, wanted for murder. ABC's James Walker reports.
Within minutes of the Pope shooting, Vatican police arrested this man, Mehmet Ali Aca. He is Turkey's most notorious right-wing extremist. Aca is believed to be 21 years old. He's a one-time economics student at the University of Istanbul. Aca first surfaced in 1979 when he was arrested at an Istanbul coffee house frequented by political extremists for the murder of Turkey's best-known journalist, Abdi İpekçi, editor of the country's most influential independent newspaper, who was shot to death on his way home. Aca admitted committing the murder, saying, "I chose İpekçi particularly because he was a Democrat, and his death was sure to cause a public fanfare." Aca, who described himself as a lone terrorist, said he also planned to kill the Soviet, American, and Israeli consuls in Istanbul. At his trial, the prosecutor said Aca belonged to an underground ultra-right-wing group called the Grey Wolves that was modeled in some ways after Germany's National Socialists. The Grey Wolves were the paramilitary wing of Turkey's National Action Party that was outlawed last September following a military coup. Aca was convicted of İpekçi's murder and sentenced to death, but then he escaped from Istanbul's maximum security military prison. 3 days later, on November 27, 1979, he threatened to kill Pope John Paul II during his visit to Turkey. Aca, who is a Muslim in a country that is 98% Muslim, wrote to a Turkish newspaper calling the pontiff a crusader commander representing Western imperialists. "If this ill-timed and meaningless visit is not called off, I will definitely shoot the Pope. This is the only reason I escaped from prison." Turkish police responded by launching the biggest search operation in modern history. Then the government ordered police to shoot Aca on sight. But no authorities could verify his whereabouts until his arrest today in Rome. James Walker, ABC News.
Standing by live now in our studios in New York is journalist Mustafa Gorsel, the Athens bureau chief of that Turkish daily newspaper, Milliyet, the paper whose editor was murdered by Mehmet Ali Aca. Mustafa, let me ask you this. The last line that James Walker had there, that the authorities had no way of knowing where this man was, you have information not quite to the contrary, but that enlarges upon that a little bit, don't you?
I think so, Ted. When he escaped from prison, it was known that he was in Turkey. Nobody knew exactly where. But especially after the military takeover in Turkey after September 12, 1980, they have had a lot of terrorists arrested who claimed that Aca had been going around for months and that he is suspected to have killed at least 20 other people. And it is also known that sometime during last summer he escaped to Germany. And Turkish government today announced that he had also been seen in Switzerland, France, Spain, and about a week ago, according to an official announcement of the Turkish government tonight, they had informed through their embassy in Rome that he had been spotted in Milan and asked that protection should be taken care.
Now, to whom was this information given?
The Turkish ambassador in Rome related to the Italian government. This is according to the official announcement of the Turkish government.
Who made the announcement and where was it made? In Istanbul? In
the
Ankara?
announcement was made in Ankara.
By whom?
By the Turkish state, the spokesman for the government.
Well, I mean, what you're saying is really extraordinary. You're saying that a man who has threatened to kill the Pope, who was wanted for murder, was spotted in Milan about a week ago.
That is what the official Turkish announcement says. What is more extraordinary, I think, is that for months the Turkish authorities had asked the German government to extradite Mehmet Ali Aca, and the German government had not responded. Now, a short while ago, I spoke with my newspaper in Turkey, and according to information I obtained from them, some of tomorrow's German papers have picked up the issue and is accusing the German government for not having taken any action against this man while he was in Germany.
Mustafa, just give us, if you would, a little bit of background on the man and on the organization to which he belonged.
Well, Aja comes from a town called Malatya in the southeastern part of Turkey. He first surfaced with the assassination of Mr. Abdi İpekçi, the editor of the leading Turkish newspaper Milliyet. He escaped from the scene of the murder. Although there were a lot of people around, he managed to escape. But eyewitnesses gave enough description of the murderer to the police that about 3 months later he was arrested in a coffee house in Istanbul. He was put on trial and placed in a high-security military prison. On November 25, 1980, a Sunday, he walked out of this military prison. I emphasize the term walk because he walked out wearing a private's uniform. And shortly after investigations, 3 low-ranking officers plus 24 privates were arrested for having aided in his escape. If not directly connected to the Nationalist Action Party, he is at least definitely connected to the underground arms of the Nationalist Action Party.
Is that the so-called Grey Wolf organization?
Well, yes, the actual name actually is Heart of Ideals, but the leader of the party refers to them as my Grey Wolves. And the leader of the party, Mr. Alparslan Türkeş, first surfaced in Turkish political scene in mid-40s as a pan-Turkism. He wanted to bring all the Turks around the world under one flag. He was interrogated during those years, but he was in the army. And later on in the 1960 military takeover in Turkey, he was one of the colonels in power. However, because of his extreme views, he was ousted from the leadership of the army and sent to New Delhi as an ambassador. He came back to Turkey and in 1965 took over an existing party and changed its name to Nationalist Action Party. And along with it, although not directly connected for legal purposes, he established Hearts of Ideals, the Grey Wolves organization. And there were summer camps, they conducted summer camps where there was militant training.
Militant training by whom? This is, this is essentially a very right-wing organization that you're talking about.
Yes, this is an extreme right-wing, fascist, racist organization.
Why do you think, Mustafa, this obsession with killing the Pope, and it was not, of course, the first time that he had threatened to kill the Pope. He threatened to kill him when the Pope first came to Istanbul in 1979.
That's right. I cannot offhand, or I don't think anyone in Turkey or anyone around the world at this moment, without having more information obtained from the attempted assassin, can really speculate on the real motive. But he saw the Pope as an agent of imperialism, according to his own words. And a Turkish journalist covering the assassination attempt today reported that he told the Italian police that he was trying to kill the Pope to protest against the imperialist actions and genocide taking place in San Salvador and in Afghanistan. But it is very difficult to find a real motive. The question is it possible for this man to have traveled from Germany, Switzerland, Spain, France, and Italy alone under false passports, under false identities? Did he act alone, or was he connected to some sort or other of international terrorism?
Well, when you raise a question like that, you clearly think you have an answer.
I don't have an answer, but I have suspicions. I very much doubt that he could have acted alone.
Mustafa, it is, of course, illogical that anyone should blame other Turks for what has happened here today. But do you have any feelings as a Turkish national because of what happened today?
I do. Of course, I'm terribly upset that someone coming from my country undertook this ridiculous, senseless act of violence. But now that we are hopeful that the pontiff is safe and will recover, I'm also a little bit glad that this man has finally been captured before committing more murders, because his capture and his interrogation by the Turkish security authorities in the future, I'm sure, is going to lead to many more arrests of that organization, and he will give much more insight to what was going on with the extreme right-wing terrorism that took place in Turkey for many years.
All right, Mustafa Gürsel, thank you very, very much indeed. Standing by live now at our affiliate KGO TV in San Francisco is Claire Sterling, an author who lives in Rome and has written extensively about international terrorism. The suspicion, the implication that Mustafa just made, do you share it? Do you think that
Yes.
here is a man who belongs to a larger terrorist organization and that they were involved in today's assassination attempt?
I can't say whether his right-wing terrorist organization was itself involved in the attempt. It's very difficult this soon in the game to have any kind of information that's worthwhile. But I certainly do agree that he must have had help while he was traveling through Europe, from Germany, crossing frontiers with false passports and so on. There is no doubt, as I've pointed out in this book I've written on the question of the terror network. I was writing mostly about the left-wing terror network, but I also pointed out that there has always been, parallel to a left-wing terror network in Europe involving left-wing Turkish terrorists, there has always been a right-wing terror network, international, organized, we're operating out of Western Europe, meeting periodically in summit meetings and so on, embracing former SS officers, the Rexist Party of Belgium, former supporters of Franco's Phalange, and so on. And I have reason to believe, I believe many reporters who have covered this field in Turkey have reason to believe that Colonel Turkesh, the leader of the Nationalist Action Party and the commander of these Grey Wolves, these neo-Nazi terrorists of the right, had traveled in Europe not very long ago and had certainly renewed his old contacts with members of the right-wing terrorist international.
But if you'll forgive me for interrupting, this seems like such a senseless attack. What would be the point, even seen from the vantage point of the extreme right, what would be the point in trying to assassinate the Pope?
Yes, I didn't mean to say by this that I thought that the Colonel Turkesh and his terrorist movement were directly responsible for this attack, because I rather doubt it, I must say. I do think that what I meant to say was that Turkesh was probably renewing old ties and connections which would have made it possible for this man to travel with help, crossing frontiers around Western Europe, evading police searches or surveillance. Using the facilities that had been set up for people like him who had in the past operated for the underground military arm of Colonel Turkesh's movement. I rather doubt that there could really be a useful motive either for terrorists of the ultra-right or the ultra-left in Turkey to have committed an act like this in Rome against the Pope. My personal feeling is that this man was probably acting either on his own or with a small fundamentalist Muslim sect which had political affinities with the neo-fascist right in Turkey.
Ms. Sterling, forgive me for interrupting. One final question that has to do now with the role of Interpol. We
Yes.
have just heard that apparently information was available from Turkish authorities that this man was in Italy. Is there such inefficiency among the various police organizations in Europe?
Well, you know, everybody talks about Italy as having Keystone Cop police, but this man was also in Germany, which is supposed to have the most efficient police force in Europe, which suggests that, first of all, it isn't so easy for a police force, however efficient in Europe, to be able to keep track of so many people connected with terrorist undergrounds of both the left and the right who circulate around Europe with a good deal of local help. I mean, both sides have their safe houses, their escape routes, their getaway paths, which are protected and sheltered. They're guided, they're helped. The police of Italy have really done a stupendous job in handling terrorism in the past year. They've arrested 1,000 terrorists in just the last year alone, and have, through those arrests, had a great many confessions which have led to the revelation of all kinds of details. And so have the Germans had the German police, great victories in rounding up known terrorists in Germany. But we must also remember that there are millions of people crossing frontiers in Europe all the time. And it requires, first of all, a great degree of coordination of police work to catch people crossing frontiers.
All right, Kirsten.
Right.
I'm afraid we're running a little bit short on time. I do thank you, however, for joining us this evening.
Right, thank you.
In a moment, we'll talk about papal security and international violence with two prominent American Catholic clergymen. When Pope John Paul visited the United States in 1979, he was greeted everywhere with remarkable enthusiasm, but there were some touchy moments from a security point of view. Standing by live now at our affiliate WPLG in Miami is Father Robert Lynch, rector of St. John's Vianney Seminary in the greater Miami area, who coordinated Pope John Paul's visit to this country. Father, we didn't hear about it at the time, but apparently a number of people feel free to talk about it now. How many close calls were there?
Well, Ted, there were only two that I'm aware of, and I was in a police command vehicle most of the time. There was an incident in New York City on Wednesday morning when we were coming down in the rain from St. Patrick's to Madison Square Garden for the event with the young people of New York. We received word that a person with a rifle had been seen on a top floor of the Statler Hotel, which is located across from Madison Square Garden. And interestingly, later in the same afternoon, there was also a report of a man on the roof with a gun in Philadelphia as we were coming down Broad Street. And on that occasion, we asked the Holy Father to take his seat in the limousine, and the motorcade sped up beyond parade speed to about 35 miles an hour for about 4 blocks. And then the Holy Father stood up again in the limousine.
What happens during those conversations, Father, when you talk to a man like Pope John Paul, who clearly places so much value on a close relationship with his public and with his flock? What goes into a conversation like that?
Well, he's not an easy man to deal with in this situation. His concern for his own personal security was never very paramount to him. He was very interested in being seen, so some of the difficult moments in the trip, as I remember it, occurred when we asked him to take some safety precaution, and most of the time he refused.
And what can you do at a time like that? Nothing, I guess.
Not very much, really. I don't think so. I think, he's a public relations man's dream, and he's a security man's nightmare in a way.
Do you have any sense that now Pope John Paul will be somewhat more cautious? Of course, the same questions were addressed to President Reagan's people and to the President himself. Is he that kind of man?
I would be surprised, Ted, if he changed his style of operation at all. I was in Rome for Holy Week and attended most of the ceremonies in St. Peter's Square and in the Basilica, and the style hasn't changed in 2 years. As I've watched the trips, especially the crush of people in Manila, it seems like the closer the people get, the more he enjoys it.
All right. Father Lynch, thank you very much indeed.
You're welcome.
Standing by live now in our studios here in Washington is Father Robert Drinan, former Democratic congressman from Massachusetts, now professor of law at Georgetown University Law School, and a leading advocate of international gun control. Father Drinan, you certainly don't take on small causes. We're having trouble enough, I suppose, in this country with gun control on a national level. You want to do it on an international level. What kind of progress do you think you can possibly make?
Well, Chad, I think it's most extraordinary that within 6 weeks, the most powerful secular ruler in the world, Mr. Reagan, and the most powerful spiritual leader in the world, the Pope, have been shot. It shows many, many things. First of all, national legislation is inadequate. The National Rifle Association today is saying that Italy had a very tough law and it didn't work in this instance. I think this demonstrates the case of the need for international treaties and covenants. I would hope that the Pope and President Reagan would see this and would urge all nations through the United Nations or through the World Health Organization to get treaties and covenants that would forbid the manufacture and the transportation of arms. This is the only way that we can limit terrorism. The stated purpose of Secretary of State Haig now of our foreign policy is to curb terrorism. You cannot curb terrorism until first you curb guns.
All right, now, Father Drinan, we know where President Reagan stands on this issue. He is no friend of gun control. What about the other man in this duet? Do you think that Pope John Paul will take a stand on that?
Well, I think he will, because he's come out for human rights all around the world, and he now personally, from this terrible tragedy, recognizes the need for some worldwide legislation. I take comfort in this, that after the murder of Bobby Kennedy and Martin Luther King in 1968, the Congress did act. Their law was quite weak, it was filled with loopholes, but they did act. And I have the hope that somehow, providentially, now this extraordinary pair of events is going to bring it about that America will take the lead along with the spiritual forces of the world so that we won't be ashamed to have 60 million handguns in this country with a murder of 20,000 people every single year, a massacre unknown in any other country of the earth.
Father Drinan, I know it's an emotional issue, and I suspect you may be projecting what you want the Pope to say, but will the Pope come out for international gun control. To the best of my knowledge, he never has.
Well, no, because it hasn't been a personal problem. I think that all of the spiritual forces of the world will, and I would hope that the people who are involved in this, the man from Turkey and the Muslim leaders, will say that we as a human race have never had the amount of guns around in the history of humanity. This is a new phenomenon. This is the very heart and soul of terrorism. If you want to eliminate terrorism, get rid of guns.
All right, Father Drinan, thanks very much for being with us. In a moment, we'll talk with Henry Kissinger and with our ABC News correspondent in Rome about the political side of Pope John Paul. It's necessary at this point to explain that because of the late hour in Rome, it's now after 5:30 in the morning, in fact it's after 6, television facilities have not been available there for several hours, so you will be hearing rather than seeing the next couple of interviews. Pope John Paul is already the most traveled pope in history, and his travels have political as well as spiritual significance. We discussed that subject earlier this evening with our Rome correspondent, Bill Blakemore. Bill, there is no correspondent here at ABC who has spent more time with the Pope and traveling all over the world with the Pope. I wonder if you would put into some kind of framework the strategy that motivates this man. I mean, he is more than just a terrific publicist. He is more than simply a religious leader. He obviously has a worldwide strategy. What is it?
Well, he clearly means to be a front-line pope. The only kind of substantive criticism I've heard of him from people in the Vatican is that he doesn't stay home and tend the store enough. It seems that he was given a kind of mandate by the Vatican people who elected him that he should reinvigorate the church and carry the message around the world. That's what he has been doing so far, and part of that has necessarily meant, as far as he's concerned, seeing as many people as possible, giving that personal touch to as many people as possible. It's certainly the case that whenever he gets with a crowd, he pushes his security and his aides aside in order to reach out literally and touch all of those hands that are reaching up to him. His aim is, at the very least, to reinvigorate the image of the church as an active church, a church of conscience.
An active church, though, Bill, in what sense? As an alternative to what?
Well, the way the Vatican people see it, it's an alternative to what they consider to have been some confusion during the past 15 years from the Roman Catholic Church. There was a general feeling in the Vatican that in the 15 years following Vatican II, the Vatican Council, there was a lack of clarity about what the Catholic Church stood for. It was generally felt then that if this Pope proved himself to be outspoken and demanded definiteness and clarity on issues, and himself embodied a person of action who wanted to speak out, that would help to win people back to the Catholic Church. In certain northern countries, they'd lost a lot of churchgoers because of what they thought was confusion. So at the very least, it was this definiteness that this Pope felt he had to carry to people, the very flavor of standing for what you believe.
All right, Bill, ideologically, sketch him in for me, from a religious point of view, from a political point of view.
From a political point of view, this Pope has a great deal of experience because he came from Poland. He was the number 2 man to Cardinal Stefan Wyszynski, who ever since the end of World War II had made a special profession of learning how to keep the allegiance of the Polish people so that he would have something to deal with when he talked to the Soviets. This Pope has used similar techniques for separating church and state in a special way. He's told all of his priests that they must not become identified with any political party, but also told them it is their duty, not just their right, but their duty to speak out for human rights. In doing this, the Pope has felt that he has to go to certain countries which have had authoritarian dictatorial regimes and demonstrate how to speak out on the issue, especially of human rights. This necessarily meant getting into the crowds and becoming highly visible. It's part of the political strategy of this Pope that he would be able to ask the allegiance of people because he did believe in human rights.
All right, but Bill, while he seems personally like such a warm, loving, and indeed he almost certainly is a warm and loving individual, nevertheless, he is not a liberal Pope, is he?
That is a rather complex issue. Certainly on the matter of abortion, on the matter of birth control, he is not a liberal Pope. He's very outspoken on those issues against abortion, against birth control, the role of women in the church, or marriage for priests. One side of the Pope that is not very well understood yet, I think, by the general public is on the matter of sexuality itself. He, in fact, is a very liberal Pope when it comes to the role of sex in people's lives. He has been speaking every Wednesday for the last year and a half or more on this particular topic and would have again today. He has said, for example, in recent speeches that any view that sees sexual intercourse as solely for the purpose of procreation is a wrong and an evil view. He says that men and women discover the meaning of life more deeply through their sexuality. But it is a topic which is something he has thought and written a great deal about even before he became Pope. Sex-related issues like abortion and birth control are ones on which he is making a point of being very outspoken and, in his case, very conservative.
All right, Bill Blakemore, I realize it's terribly late in Rome now, but there must be an enormous sense of relief in that city tonight.
I believe there is generally. The political leaders here have been going to the hospital all evening, and when the doctor came out after that four-hour-plus operation and said, I think the way he put it in Italian was, the Pope will be staying with us, there was a great deal of relief. We don't expect to have a final prognosis on the condition of the Pope for a few hours yet. It'll be the morning here before we have any clear word on just how well he did come through. But we do have the report that the bullet seems to have hit miraculously, as they have said, no vital organs. And so for the moment, it's a hopeful note.
Earlier this evening, we also discussed the Pope and his role on the international scene with former Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, whom we contacted in Zurich, Switzerland.
Well, what is unique about John Paul is his ability to move people and somehow to make religious teaching appear relevant to their daily lives rather than to something that they do on Sunday in church. And therefore his appearances around the world have been important political facts in which, on the one hand, he attempted, as I understand, to indicate that there are some fundamental values that must guide change, and this is a lesson he tried to teach to reformers. And at the same time, to tell governments that the status quo cannot be sacrosanct, and that they must respond to these needs. And no other pope in our lifetime has had this symbolic impact in so many different continents.
To what degree, Dr. Kissinger, do you think that his experience as a cardinal in Poland, dealing with the Communist Party in Poland and dealing very indirectly with the Soviet Union, to what degree do you think that has prepared him uniquely for the role that he is now playing?
Well, I think it has given him a sense of the impact of totalitarianism on the quality of human life and on the destruction of the human personality. But it has also made clear to him that it cannot simply be fought as an economic program, but it has to be fought in the name of some spiritual values, and has given him an understanding of what has led people in that direction.
Do you think he makes the Kremlin somewhat nervous?
I would think that he represents a profound challenge to totalitarian systems.
On both sides of the spectrum?
On both sides of the spectrum.
All right, Dr. Henry Kissinger, thank you very much indeed. I know it's very late there in Switzerland, and our deepest appreciation to you for coming on Nightline. Thank you, sir.
Good night.
Standing by live now in our studios here in Washington is Father Francis X. Murphy, rector of Holy Redeemer College here in Washington, and a well-known observer of Vatican politics who has written extensively on the papacy. Father Murphy, who's in charge at the Vatican these days?
I would say the Secretary of State, Cardinal Agostino Casaroli. However, the Pope is still very much in charge. It's merely that Casaroli takes care of the ordinary day-by-day business.
Is there a parallel kind of organizational chart such as the one that we saw and heard being discussed here 6 weeks ago when we were dealing with our own national problem?
No, not really. The Pope is the head of the Church, and these people are his subordinates, but not in a line of command. The Pope is the Pope, and he is the vicar of Christ, and Christ has no substitutes. Peculiarly enough, we have a man in the Vatican called the sostituto, the substitute, but he's the substitute in the Secretary of State, and he is usually the Pope's right-hand man. Right now, he is a Spaniard by the name of Menendez.
So literally what happens to the business of the church while the Pope is indisposed? I mean, that's happened before.
It keeps right on going. You have some 14 congregations, which means groups of cardinals who run the different departments. You have 3 or 4 secretariats with a cardinal and a whole group of bishops and priests, and nuns now, and a few lay people who carry on as if the Pope was still there at the top.
Forgive me for pressing this point, Father Murphy, but obviously there has to be a difference between a time when the Pope is physically there and running things on a day-by-day basis and when he is indisposed. What would the difference then be?
There isn't very much. He's been away from Rome for periods of 8, 10, 12 days, and Rome carries on very much without him. He's not very much in contact by telephone. They know his mind, and for the most part, the cardinals who make the decisions in the different departments go ahead.
Father Francis Murphy, it's late. It's very good of you to have stayed with us this long. Thank you, sir.
Good.
In a moment, we'll have reports on reaction in this country and around the world to the shooting of the Pope. The Pope is, of course, the spiritual leader of the world's more than 500 million Roman Catholics, and the attack on John Paul II today was an event of stunning international proportions. Here in the United States, parochial schools in dozens of cities halted classes and sent their students to Mass to pray for the Pope. The National Council of Churches, made up of the nation's Protestant, Anglican, and Orthodox church leaders, adopted a special resolution at its convention in Philadelphia. A resolution calling for an end to violence and the ever-increasing manufacture of instruments of human destruction. For one city in the United States, Pope John Paul has a very special importance. Max Robinson reports now from Chicago.
Ted, Chicago has the largest Polish community in the nation, the largest, in fact, outside the city of Warsaw, Poland. The feelings here of love and respect for Pope John Paul II are especially strong.
Oh, my, this is terrible. I don't know what to say. I have to go in and pray that he's all right.
Many did pray. Catholics, Protestants, and thousands of Polish Americans at special masses hastily arranged for the man they love as Holy Father and countryman.
They shoot our president, they shoot our Pope. It scares me, absolutely frightens me.
I'm just so tired of hearing leaders being shot.
We just hope and we pray that he will recover. That's all we can do for it.
The Pope spent 2 days in Chicago during his trip to America. He was overcome with love in the streets and in the churches. But the Pope's exposure to large crowds even then caused some concern.
What has happened, we dreaded what happened in this age of assassinations, in an age when the Pope became so available to audiences, to the people at large.
When he was my guest here a year ago, last October, I know that the Secret Service people and the police and all those concerned with his safety were sometimes concerned about him. But as he said to me, who would want to shoot a pope?
Everyone in the Polish community was asking that question today as the largest circulation Polish newspaper in this country prepared a special edition.
I'm getting the report direct from Rome about his condition.
In Detroit, the Pope's cousin was trying to understand.
The Holy Father has lived in the area of this world where there has been tremendous amount of suffering. And he's conditioned to it. And I'm sure that he just forgives this person. Compassion. And it's unfortunate a man who has done nothing but work for the peace should be chosen by some terrorist. Where is this all going to end?
Tonight, here in Chicago, many Catholic churches will remain open throughout the night as this largely Catholic city with its big Polish population prays for the speedy recovery of Pope John Paul II. Ted?
Thank you, Max. Washington, a city still shaken by the attack on President Reagan 6 weeks ago, reacted with shock to the attempt on the life of the Pope. Shock at the event itself and at the international atmosphere it seems to reflect. Bettina Gregory reports.
In the face of senseless violence, there is not much else one can do but pray. Many did this evening at the church where services were held for President Kennedy after his assassination 18 years ago. Cabinet officials were struck by the brutal coincidence the attempt on the Pope's life followed so closely on the heels of the attack on President Reagan.
I don't believe we're in a sick society. I just hope not. But having one on top of the other is a little difficult to take.
Do you think there's anything that can be done about it?
I pray to God there is.
The Speaker of the House, Tip O'Neill, came to pray for the Pope, as did Secretary of State Alexander Haig and the President's National Security Advisor, Richard Allen. The Polish ambassador was there, too.
And for the Polish people, it was a great shock.
And so it was also for ordinary Americans, stunned at the climate of violence we live with.
I think it's, coming more and more that anyone in the eye or political or religious eyes are being shot, and that it's really sad.
It's such a shame that the people who always strive for peace are always the one who, in the end, are affected in some violent manner.
Alleluia, alleluia, alleluia, alleluia, alleluia, alleluia.
Peace be with you. From the bottom of my heart, I thank you for coming this evening to join in this Mass wherein we pray for the recovery of our Holy Father.
The Archbishop of Washington celebrated the Mass, giving voice to the genuine disbelief that this Pope, a man of peace, a man who lived to mingle with his flock, was the target of a would-be assassin.
Pope John Paul truly loves the people. He enjoys his work with them. I cannot presume to place words in his mouth, but I suspect that if he were to choose, it would be to meet danger, even death, actively at work, greeting and serving his people.
The Archbishop said the Pope believes love is stronger than danger, but he prayed nevertheless that the veil of terrorism and violence would be lifted from this world. His words and the Mass itself perhaps testimony that prayer is the triumph of faith over the expectation of continuing violence in our times. Bettina Gregory, ABC News, Washington.
Endless is the same.
Also here in Washington, the Senate paused in its work to pass a resolution offering prayers for the Pope's recovery and paid tribute to him as a good shepherd who has been a sign of hope for all people of every faith. Senator Edward Kennedy said in a statement, "This is a shot that has gone to the soul of the world." The reaction was also one of concern and emotion at the White House, where the Pope has been an honored guest. White House correspondent Sam Donaldson reports.
October 1979, Pope John Paul II visits the White House at the invitation of then-President Carter.
Pope wants to bless you with the permission of the President of the United States. Benedicat vos omnipotens Deus, Pater, et Filius, et Spiritus Sanctus. Amen. Thank you very much.
For all Americans, it was a dramatic moment. This morning at the White House, President Reagan was ironically discussing ways of combating violent crime with a group of senators as the Pope was approaching his fateful moment. Shortly after the meeting ended, the President got the word of the shooting. Aides say he was shocked and said, "I'll pray for him." Almost immediately, he called Cardinal Cook in New York.
I received a phone call from the President. In fact, just a few moments after I happened to hear it, the radio report, and the President expressed his deep concern and then assured me of special prayers for the Holy Father. And we spoke just a little bit about, how this happened. And I'm sure the President was thinking, too, of, how close it was for him and how the Lord had spared him to continue serving.
The president, in a statement issued when the Pope's surgery had been completed, said in part, "The world is horrified and all of us grieve over this terrible act of violence. We are grateful that he has been spared. We pray that all of us will heed Pope John Paul's call for a world of love, not of hate." Vice President Bush called the shooting madness.
What's happening in the world? What kind of madness has been let loose? It's a tragedy. It's a tragedy. Some have thought maybe these things are happening mainly in the United States. It's a worldwide sickness. And international terror and this kind of madness, whatever it turns out to be, is we've got to find some way to do something about it.
What do we do about it?
If I had an easy answer, well, I'd have had to put it into effect, I'll tell you. I don't know. But it's not going to keep public figures from doing our job. I mean, I don't, and I expect people in the Holy See feel the same way. I mean, you can't be intimidated by international lawlessness and lawlessness of any kind.
Bush's point is that if public figures can be intimidated, the terrorists win. And not the shooting of President Reagan, not the shooting of the Pope, must be allowed to hand that madness in the world its victory. Sam Donaldson, ABC News, the White House.
In a moment, some closing thoughts on violence from Pope John Paul himself. It is perhaps most fitting to close this broadcast with some words from Pope John Paul himself. The time was the 29th of December, 1979. The place, a small town outside Dublin. The Pope had tailored his remarks to address the subject of violence in Northern Ireland, but he spoke in general terms which, ironically, are applicable to the events of this day also.
Christianity does not command us to close our eyes to difficult human problems. It does not permit us to neglect and refuse to see unjust social or international situations. What Christianity does forbid is to seek solutions to these situations by the ways of hatred, by the murdering of defenseless people, by the methods of terrorism. Let me say more. Christianity understands and recognizes the noble and just struggle for justice. But Christianity is decisively opposed to fomenting hatred and to promoting or provoking violence or struggle for the sake of struggle. The command, "Thou shalt not kill," must be binding on the conscience of humanity.
Pope John Paul in September of 1979 in Ireland. And so, to summarize the situation at this time, the Pope is now resting at Rome's Gemelli Hospital, where he was rushed after being shot earlier today and where he underwent 4 hours and 20 minutes of surgery. The Pope is now reported in satisfactory condition. The man accused of shooting Pope John Paul, a Turkish right-wing extremist wanted for murder in Turkey, is in police custody with no word yet on the eventual disposition of his case. ABC News coverage of the aftermath to the shooting of Pope John Paul will continue tomorrow, starting with Good Morning America, with special reports throughout the day as developments warrant, and of course with a complete wrap-up on World News Tonight, with Peter Jennings heading the ABC News team reporting from Rome. Also tomorrow on ABC's 2020, a special report on Pope John Paul, the most public of popes. That's our report for tonight. This is Ted Koppel in Washington. For all of us here at ABC News, good night. The international climate of violence. Is the phenomenon really a new one? As we report the latest details on the aftermath of Pope John Paul's shooting, we'll be talking live with Italian journalist Oriana Fallaci and with author Elie Wiesel on whether the world has entered a whole new cycle of terrorism and violence.
This is ABC News Nightline. Reporting from Washington, Ted Koppel.
Good evening. We're going to do tonight what many of you have been doing since you first heard yesterday that someone had tried to assassinate the Pope. We're going to try to find some meaning in the event, some pattern in the apparently random spread of violence in the world these days. Do we, in fact, live in particularly violent times? Has the pervasiveness of violence in the movies, on television, in our literature spilled over irretrievably into our lives? Or is it perhaps that the same level of violence has always been with us, but that we're simply more aware of it in this electronic age? We'll raise those questions with two prominent writers who've devoted much of their lives to an examination of violent behavior. But first, the latest victim of that violence, Pope John Paul, who lies in a Rome hospital tonight as the result of yesterday's assassination attempt. Our correspondent, John Lawrence, is standing by live via telephone circuit in Rome right now. John, can you bring us up to date on the Pope's latest condition, or on the latest reports of that condition?
Yes, Ted, we're expecting another medical bulletin in a few hours here, as once again the sun comes up over Rome. The Pope is in serious condition. He continues what his doctors describe as an excellent recovery at Gemelli Hospital. The doctors say they've been able to cut down on the amount of sedatives they've been giving the Pope. We know he's being fed intravenously. He's being kept in a completely sterilized room, talking to his doctors by an intercom to reduce the chance of infection. One of the doctors said today the Pope's a little depressed, and their prognosis is still very guarded. The biggest dangers, the doctors say, is the risk of infection, and that risk is said to be quite high.
John, the Pope has received some visitors today, hasn't he?
Yes, he did. We know of at least 3 cardinals who went to visit the Pope today. A Polish nun. They spent a great deal of time praying with the Pope. He was sitting up in bed. His voice was said to be clear. He's conscious, but as we said, under some sedation.
Do we know, John, on what basis we've received the word of his depression? That is one word that I have never heard associated with this Pope.
Yes, unfortunately, it was only that brief, fragmentary comment by one of his doctors that the Pope seemed a bit depressed, and we cannot tell you why, although one can certainly imagine it.
All right, John, I want to get back to the subject of the Pope himself in just a moment, but of course there were 2 other persons who were injured, 2 American women. What about their condition?
Well, Anne Odra, the 58-year-old lady from Buffalo, New York, who was wounded close to the Pope, is still in serious condition. She had an operation to remove her spleen. She did receive a visitor today from her daughter, Joanne Konjarski, who flew here from the United States to see her. And the other younger woman, Rose Hall, who used to live in New York State, is reported to be in good condition, recovering from her leg wound.
All right, John, I know you have a videotape package for us, and it must indeed have been an extraordinary day there in Rome.
Yes, indeed, Ted. The Vatican, as you know, has been the scene of some historic and moving moments down over the years, and I witnessed one of them in St. Peter's Square earlier this evening.
The prayers of the faithful being said here in St. Peter's Square tonight on behalf of the seriously wounded Pope, resting in his hospital bed just a few miles from here.
They came from Rome and all over the world. Nuns and priests, Catholics and non-Catholics, local residents and visiting tourists. An estimated 30,000 people come to pray for the health of the Pope and a quick recovery from his gunshot wound. Visitors to the Pope's bedside today reported him to be alert, speaking with them in a clear, soft voice. Much of the time was spent in prayer. One cardinal said the Pope bears no resentment toward the young man who tried to kill him. The Vatican released more pictures today of the scene in St. Peter's Square just after yesterday's shooting. Pope John Paul was struck by 3 bullets fired at close range as he mingled with the crowd, unsuspecting and unprotected from the assassination attempt. Today, Italian police continued their interrogation of the accused assailant, 23-year-old Mehmed Ali Aja. He was formally charged today with attempted murder. Police say the suspect is a known terrorist who escaped from a Turkish prison last year. Aja had been convicted in Turkey for the murder of a newspaper editor and was linked with an extreme right-wing organization there. However, Italian authorities quoted Aja as saying he's a follower of a left-wing Palestinian organization, the PFLP. My life doesn't have any more sense, he told police. Nothing matters to me. Aja is said to be refusing to eat and has begun a hunger strike. Police have recovered a 9mm Browning automatic pistol believed to be the weapon used to shoot the Pope. They displayed Aja's forged passport and have traced his movements from this Rome hotel room where he's said to have registered under a false name the day before the shooting. But the big question police are trying to answer is, what made him do it? A note police say they took from Aja reportedly said he tried to kill the Pope to protest American and Soviet imperialism. If the attempted assassination of Pope John Paul II appeared to some to be an illogical outburst of individual violence and rage, the attempt to help his recovery through prayers at St. Peter's Square tonight was a collective outpouring of love and faith. John Lawrence, ABC News, the Vatican.
In a moment, some thoughts from correspondent Jim Wooten on the questions raised by the attempt to kill the Pope. And we'll talk live with 2 prominent writers about the apparent spread of violence in our time. The attack on the Pope yesterday in Rome was anything but an isolated event in recent history. It was, to the contrary, an act that has been repeated with such frequency that once again we're compelled to ponder its meaning. Here is correspondent James Wooten.
It seems to me that the question here is at least as important as the answer, and perhaps more so. To tell you the truth, I'm not sure I know what question to ask right now. Is it what sort of world do we live in? Is it what sort of man would do this sort of thing? Is it why is this happening with such regularity these days? I don't know. And I don't know that any of us can frame the proper question now. But the events of yesterday do lead us all inexorably to an even more basic question. A question of definition. What, for example, what precisely is the definition of assassination? Or perhaps better ask, what is the essential difference between an assassination, pure and simple, and madness, pure and simple? This memorial is dedicated to the victim of an assassin. John Wilkes Booth, no matter how misguided he may have been, was deeply committed to the Confederacy. He killed Abraham Lincoln because of that fervor. That doesn't make it right. That doesn't make it any less dreadful. But in the scheme of history with all its convolutions, it does help to make it more comprehensible. The same is true for Presidents Garfield and McKinley. Assassinations, pure and simple. For different reasons, of course, and not for reasons that you or I could sanely accept, but assassinations nevertheless. And Leon Trotsky? Sure. And the Kennedy brothers? Yes. And perhaps Malcolm X, and probably Martin Luther King, if you accept his killer's equation of racism with politics. But since then, we seem to have moved into an era when those pulling the triggers are doing so for reasons other than assassinations, for reasons that have to do with the striving for personal identity, for reasons that have to do perhaps with Andy Warhol's silly forecast that sooner or later all of us will become famous for 15 minutes. Arthur Brimmer and George Wallace. The boy was completely bereft of politics. He hardly knew that 2 major political parties existed in this country, Squeaky Fromme and Sarah Jane Moore. They could hardly identify their own ideologies, much less Gerald Ford's. And this Chapman boy, he seemed to believe he was John Lennon. He resented the fact that others didn't recognize him as a Beatle. And Hinckley, well, he tried to shoot President Reagan because somehow he believed that if he did, a young actress would fall in love with him. Assassinations, hardly. Moments of pure madness. And the common thread in each was that the man or the woman behind the gun was trying to take some of the celebritude of his victim. In a way, most of them succeeded. Now comes this young man who shoots the Pope and says he's politically motivated. Perhaps. But although it's difficult for you and I to ascertain just how the world might have changed politically had he been successful, it is very clear that he has become a celebrity. Sort of. Perhaps that's the kind of world we live in. James Wooten, ABC News, Washington.
Oriana Fallaci is a well-known Italian journalist who has written extensively on the subject of violence. Her latest book, entitled A Man, deals with a would-be assassin described by Greek authorities as a terrorist, but who was seen by his political allies as a freedom fighter. Oriana, I suppose that's as good a place to begin as any. It's been said again and again and again, one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. It's hard to find any possible justification for what happened yesterday or the justification for that act. But how, first of all, do we describe this act?
Well, Ted, first of all, I refuse to consider the example of my book as a book on violence and the story of my book as a story of violence and the man of my book as a violent man. To begin with, is a man that who killed nobody,
but he
who was killed instead,
but he tried to kill someone.
Who tried to kill someone because that someone, Ted, was a tyrant, because he was a dictator. That was if you want to call it violence, which I refuse, then you have to call it legitimate violence, because if you don't call it legitimate violence and you call it illegitimate, then you have to call illegitimate all the resistance in Europe against the Nazi fascism, which I wouldn't permit to you to do, and many other examples in history, and you should call illegitimate violence even, I should say, the making of your country, which I'm sure you wouldn't permit to yourself.
All right, let's stop there for a moment and let's take this opportunity to introduce a victim of that particular brand of violence that you were speaking of a moment ago. Also standing by tonight in our New York studios is author Elie Wiesel, himself a victim of the Nazi Holocaust. Much of Mr. Wiesel's work has focused on what might be called the ultimate terrorism, the systematic brutalizing of individuals by totalitarian regimes. Elie, is it possible to describe any act of violence, even if it is against tyranny, even if it is against brutality, as justified?
Yes and no. I was listening to Oriana, and of course, had there been a man or a woman in 1936, 38, to kill Hitler, well, his act would have been, I think, in history judged as a very important act on behalf of mankind. But this is really an exercise in philosophy and morality or immorality, which is very hard to discuss now. For instance, now I'm obsessed with the fear of violence. I see what is happening in the world, and to me it seems like madness. And that is really what my fear is, that day after day there is so much violence in this world that it follows a certain pattern which leads to madness and perhaps comes from madness. So you know that in history we have facts, we have stories of madness that erupted in mankind. The Crusades were madness. The Inquisition was madness. Occasionally in Africa or in Asia, small countries or large countries begin to killing one another for no reason whatsoever.
Let me stop you for a moment, Elie. It seems to me that we have established the parameters of violence with, at one extreme, Adolf Hitler, and possibly the ability of the act at the other end of the scale, the attempt to kill Pope John Paul yesterday. Clearly, I don't think any civilized human being could justify that. But what falls in between? What kind of a world do we live in today? One in which violence has become more a part of our lives than ever before, or is this something we've lived with forever? Oriana?
Ted, I don't think that we can say that today that our times are more violent than the others, because there are no elements to say that. I mean, we have the statistics of the violence in our time, but we do not have the statistics in the past. And I wouldn't say that it was much better 100, 200, 500, 1,000 years ago. And we all know that violence has been a constant component of history. I mean, we all know that history has not been written with ink, it has been written with blood. What happens today, I would say, there is a major information on violence. We know more thanks to all the channels of information, radio, TV, printed press, of course. And therefore, there is a major awareness of it.
All right, let me continue with both your thoughts on that when we continue our conversation in a moment. Joining us once again from New York, journalist Oriana Fallaci and novelist Elie Wiesel. Elie, do you accept what Oriana had to say a moment ago, this notion that somehow we've been this violent for 100, 200, 500 years, but now we just know more about it?
No, not entirely, no. Of course, on one level, Cain and Abel began with violence. The history of mankind began with violence. But one thing which is, I think, today so damaging and so terrifying, that we are getting so accustomed to violence that we are almost in a state of atrophy. Death used to be a blemish. It used to be a scandal in existence, our own and other people's death. And today somehow we got used to it. The fact that we can see so many people being killed day after day. There are so many wars going on a permanent basis. This is what frightens me. What frightens me really, Oriana, is that you think that it is a natural, that violence is part of the human condition. We should be shocked, we should be outraged, and I think a generation ago we were outraged. When I was a child, and you weren't even born then, I think I was outraged each time a person was beaten up, let alone being killed. And yet I belong to a people that lost many, many children and many, many people as victims. Today we live in a society where people are no longer surprised even. They are shocked but not surprised.
All right, Oriana, don't wait for me, you jump in.
I don't agree, because we are outraged. I am outraged. We are saddened. We are enraged. And we are so much that we are here to discuss about it. We are here to discuss because the Pope has been shot. May I recall you that 11 popes in the history of the popes have been killed, strangled, poisoned, killed by sword. That Pope Paul VI has had 4 attempts to his life. We shouldn't forget that. We are kind of used, it's true, but we are used for thousands of years. It is not that we don't give importance to life. On the contrary, we are here because we love life and we hate death.
Let me ask both of you a question, if I may. Has there been a democratization of violence? And by that I mean it used to be the province of princes and dukes. They would order the killings. And yet today it is very much the act of common men and women to go after celebrities, whether they're political celebrities or show business celebrities, or now we have a clerical celebrity.
I have a theory about it. I mean, I might be wrong. It's an opinion to be listened to. And it is this. We have been living in a relatively peaceful time. At least we didn't have war at home in the last 35 years. War is organized violence. It's violence administrated scientifically for massacres, killing in large numbers. When the war, and in time of war, violence is requisitioned, canalized by war. When war is over, violence, it is not over. And it is no more canalized, it's no more requisitioned to be administrated scientifically. It's still there, And it goes on bursting in a different way in small groups with individual acts. And this is one reason, in my opinion.
All right.
The other reason...
That would, forgive me, because we only have a minute and a half left, and I want to give Elie Wiesel a chance, too. That would seem to suggest, then, that man's basic nature is violence. Elie, do you believe that?
I hope not, but facts prove that I'm often wrong. My theory is that a certain amount of evil and violence have been unleashed 1 generation ago, when a whole people had been threatened to be exterminated, and then other peoples as well. And the sequels are still here. Now there is a nihilist movement, whether organized or not, I don't know, but there is a nihilist movement all over the world trying to destabilize society, and therefore they are using their methods, which is political assassination, philosophical assassination, theological assassination, or clerical assassination. Whether they will succeed or not is, of course, a very important, vital question, because our lives are at stake, and the life of mankind is at stake.
I'm afraid on that point, I'm going to have to close with both of you. I thank you very much. Elie Wiesel, Oriana Fallaci, thank you for being with us. I'll have the last word on today's news in a moment. Now, the last word on today's news and a first look at tomorrow. U.S. Middle East envoy Philip Habib held more talks in Damascus today, then flew back to Israel for another round with Israeli Prime Minister Begin. But there's no sign of breakthrough on the issue of Syrian missiles in Lebanon. Those missiles today shot down a pilotless Israeli reconnaissance plane. U.S. officials say the robot plane was not important compared to the information it gathered. In Washington, Secretary of State Haig said time is running out for the effort to negotiate a settlement between Syria and Israel. A House-Senate Conference Committee reached agreement today on the outlines of a fiscal 1982 budget based on President Reagan's stiff budget-cutting plan. At the White House, President Reagan told a group of senators who had voted for his program they had helped restore faith in the way the American system works. And President Reagan's son, Michael, today denied there was anything wrong in using his father's name in a letter soliciting contracts from U.S. military bases. But, said Michael Reagan, he'll quit his job with the California defense firm. The president has asked the White House to advise first family members on how to avoid even the appearance of impropriety. Looking ahead at tomorrow, President Reagan will meet at the White House with South African Foreign Minister Botha. The Teamsters Union leadership will meet in Las Vegas to choose an interim president to succeed the late Frank Fitzsimmons. And the Federal Reserve Board will release industrial production figures for April. There'll be a complete wrap-up of the day's news tomorrow on World News Tonight, and Peter Jennings will continue to anchor coverage of the aftermath of the shooting of Pope John Paul from Rome. That's our report for tonight. This is Ted Koppel in Washington. For all of us here at ABC News, good night.
This has been ABC News Nightline. Good Morning America covers overnight developments around the world, and each evening at the dinner hour, ABC's World News Tonight has a complete wrap-up on the day's top stories. Nightline is a presentation of ABC News.